And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard R.J. Eskow. We keep being told we live in a global world, and we certainly do, but often it seems as if our news coverage is anything but global. Our economic analyses are anything but global, and that will be the topic, at least the initial topic of my conversation with my next guest. I always look forward to his appearances, and I know from your emails and comments that you do too. Professor Richard Wolff is an economist and an economic historian. He is a professor emeritus at University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is also a visiting professor at New York University. He is the author of a number of books, and he is the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV. And but I need not have done that, because if you're a regular listener, you know all about him. So without any further ado, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, RJ. I'm glad, as always, to be with you on these conversations.
Same here. One of the things that I've found fascinating for a long time, and kind of pondered in a media darkness a bit, is China's evolution and rise. We had the science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson on a couple of years ago because he wrote a novel about a future where China was the dominant world power on Earth and in the moon in his novel. And I feel as if tectonic shifts are taking place in global power relationships and that we don't know enough about them. And you talked about that a little bit in our last conversation, and I was wondering what your thinking is these days about that.
Well, let me pick up on one dimension of what you just said. I'm struck as an American. I was born in Ohio. I've lived here all my life. I've worked here all my life. And I may be wrong about this, but I really do feel it more strongly with each passing month, that the level of non-information coupled with the level of misinformation about our relationships with adversaries, allies, and so on is a real telling example of both self-delusion on a national scale and also a very dangerous signal that somehow the real world is so difficult that we're going to turn away from it and make things up. We see that every day, and the country is talking about it in relationship to COVID, how bad it is, how serious it is, whether you need a mask, whether you should have a mask, whether the government should tell you to get vaccinated, and all the rest. But I think I can show you with a couple of examples that it's at least as bad a mixture of non-information and misinformation when it comes to the rest of the world. So let me give you my two examples, and maybe we can talk about them. To pick up with your reference to China, the last couple of weeks have been for me crystal clear evidence of something that I thought was emerging and that now has emerged, so I can speak about it with considerably more confidence. The United States wants to have a Cold War with China. It started when the Obama administration decided that the long policy of cooperation with China, initiated by Nixon and Kissinger way back when they went to China and resumed diplomatic relations and all of that. And so we had a period of quite some decades, several, of cooperation, profitable for the United States for sure, for many corporations. This is the period of time in which Walmart goes from a relatively minor regional department store into the behemoth that it is today, an event that could never have happened if Walmart wasn't the outlet for everything China produced, et cetera, et cetera. Obama pivoted to Asia for American foreign policy. So did the military. Mr. Trump was publicly aggressive in doing all of this on a grand scale with his trade war, his tariff war, his arranging for the arrest of the woman executive from the Huawei Corporation that was finally resolved a week or so ago, et cetera, et cetera. And now the Biden administration, having given some people hope that he wouldn't continue that, has in fact continued it, and if anything, become more aggressive in rhetoric at least, and in symbolism. Here's what I want people to understand. A week or so ago, the United States announced a change of policy again, this time in collaboration with the United Kingdom and Australia. By the way, that's a collaboration, the metaphorical equivalent of an elephant arranging a very important collaboration with two beetles. Anyway, this collaboration, which should remind you of the coalition that fought in Afghanistan or Iraq, was undertaken to equip the Australians with nuclear submarines, violating all kinds of commitments about non-proliferation of nuclear capability and so on. But the important part of that, which was all about arming against China and all the rest, was that the United States could not get, here's the important point, could not get any other European country to go along with this. Not only that, but the Europeans have gone out of their way. Official statements from the European Union getting virtually no coverage in the United States, in which these statements say unequivocally, and they repeat them, I'm virtually quoting, under no circumstances will we in Europe participate in any way in a new Cold War against China. I mean, you could not have a more glaring state, much more important than the remarks of the French foreign minister that the deal the US made with Australia was the equivalent, and I quote, of a stab in the back, which is what the man said in front of the TV cameras. Europe is cutting its deals with China as fast as they can. They are trying to do it selectively. They don't want to explode the difference with the United States, but they've made their decision and they are pursuing an independent foreign policy from that of the United States. And that's a major split in the West of a sort we have not seen since the end of the Second World War. And that has to be understood, discussed, evaluated, and so far, it's rather the opposite. We're pretending as a nation that this isn't happening. Number two, still with the same topic, there are no Chinese naval boats in the Gulf of Mexico. There are no Chinese naval boats that are announced or known or even asserted by the United States anywhere near U.S. territorial waters. But the United States Navy is busy in the South China Sea, 10,000 miles away at the border of China together. I mean, who's aggressing whom, would you imagine? And I'm not even talking about the role that the United States played for the last century and a half in the colonial adventures in China, and the fact that there's no comparable relationship between the Chinese on the one hand and the United States. And the history, this is a very dangerous game that's being played. It marks a radical departure from earlier policies, and it risks and this is very important, it risks military and diplomatic confrontations of a sort the United States has not faced before. A war, or anything like a war, with Iraq or with Afghanistan or with Vietnam has nothing in common with what we are talking about now. Those were all very small, very poor, badly militarily equipped countries. The wars with them were literally David versus Goliath. If you make trouble for China, this is an entirely different animal here. This is, and has to be understood by the American people, that when you're going around rattling your saber in the face of the Chinese, you are taking chances and making blunders on a scale that will make in history what we did in Iraq, where we failed, or in Afghanistan, where we failed, or in Vietnam, where we failed, look like child's play in comparison.
I'm sorry. Yeah, a couple observations or questions, if I may, before you go on, because there's so much there, right? I mean, one is, first of all, gunboats in Chinese waters have a long and I suspect, far from forgotten history among the Chinese, going back to the Boxer Rebellion, I would think, or thereabouts.
Yep.
And so I don't think we fully, as Americans, tend to understand just how provocative our behavior is being, number one. But number two, the operative word in my head as you were speaking was denial. That, in other words, maybe I'm wrong, but I look at Europe's behavior in cutting its own deals with China. I look at the Pacific Agreement, where so many countries cut separate deals with China in the Pacific sphere. And I could be wrong, but I see a world that is recognizing or believing that after 75 years with the United States as the dominant global economic power, its power is declining, a new power is rising. We would be well served to make our agreements with the new power. And what I see from our end, whether it's our military fist waving or our failure to internalize the message of those separate deals, what I see is, I'm thinking of the older Britons that would say the sun will never set on the British Empire after it has set on the entire empire everywhere. Is that the message here, that we're not understanding the profound shift in power away from us, and that we think that we can harmlessly sort of get them back in line with our gunships or whatever, when really we're looking at a profound shift?
Yes. The short answer to your question is absolutely. That's what I think is going on. Let me give you a metaphor to get at it another way. It is clear that all kinds of people understood years ago that the attempt to destroy the Taliban and to rebuild a new society and a new government in Afghanistan would not work when the Americans were doing it any better than when other powers in the past have tried it, Britain, Russia, and so on. But we couldn't get out. We were there for 20 years because no leader, no president, no head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the military wanted to be the one presiding over the admission. And finally, it became so costly and so absurd that Trump and then Biden said, okay, we will now, it'll be safe. We will mumble about withdrawal and hope that people don't use the word defeat, which is what it was. I'm seeing the same thing. I think we are in a long-term, probably longer than 20 years, denial, I think your word is perfect, of what we already know and what the world already sees. and we can't quite face it. And so we're acting rituals of symbolism, gunboats, calling the leader names, making up stories. I mean, I could go on and on about it. Meanwhile, quietly, the facts that really matter are buried because they're inconvenient. Again, a couple of examples. Absolutely crucial for both world trade and economic development in the world today are high speed trains. It's a way of cutting the cost of moving goods and people over all kinds of distances that is less dangerous, less polluting, less costly than the automobile or the vehicle or the air. I mean, and that's not going to change. So high-speed rail is an enormous thing. Out of the total mileage of high-speed rail in the world today, 2/3 of it is inside the People's Republic of China. The United States has virtually none. The only running one is the one from Washington to Boston, the Acela, which is not high speed by the definitions in other part of the world because it's significantly slower at its maximum than the high speed trains in many other parts of the world. I mean, even if Mr. Biden were to get his $3.5 trillion infrastructure, it wouldn't catch the United States up for decades with where the Chinese are. This has to be faced. You have to ask the question, what in the world is going on that I could have to say what I just said? And if I had more time, I'd give you more examples. But let me give you my second example and then sort of let it go. On the 26th of September, there was a national election in Germany. Germany is the most important economy in Europe. Everybody knows that. Whatever Europe does, it'll have to be worked out with Germany. I mean, France, Italy, and Spain are important as well, but basically Germany is the powerhouse. So an election there is something of enormous importance, okay? So first, how many Americans understand that the leader they kept referring to as the conservative Merkel government, Angela Merkel, that was not her government. For the last 8 years, her party couldn't get a majority of votes ever in Germany. They had to make coalitions. And how many Americans understand that the coalition partner of the Merkel government, the only way she could govern, was the German Socialist Party? I mean, when I make statements in auditoriums and I say that, people look at me as if I either were crazy and had lost my mind or was so misinformed that they would like to rush up to the auditorium to correct me. And I have to repeat it 2 or 3 times, even though it's completely well known everywhere in the world by anybody who pays attention. It's extraordinary. Okay, in this last election, something even more extraordinary happened. The conservatives fell more drastically than at any time since the Second World War and ended up with something in the neighborhood of 24% of the total vote for the conservatives. The party that came in first, beating the conservatives by 1 or 2 percentage points, was the German Socialist Party, which means that the largest political party in Germany is now the Socialists, who, by the way, control the government in Portugal, are that basically in control in Spain, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Europe is very, how shall I put it, socialist in its orientation. I don't think Americans have any clue as to what this means and where it comes from. And Mrs. Merkel, the conservative, let me remind you what she presided over: a society in which every worker must be given by law 5 weeks, or to be exact, 24 days, 24 work days of paid, 100% paid vacation. On top of that, depending on which state in Germany you live in, between 9 and 12 100% paid holidays. I mean, for an American, this is unthinkable. And Mrs. Merkel, the conservative, never said boo about this. And you know why? Because if she threatened it, if she spoke against it, she'd be looking not at 24%, she'd be looking at 10% of the vote. So it's out. There's a national health service that basically covers everybody from birth to death. The tuition and fees at all public universities, and public universities are the overwhelmingly dominant higher education structure in Germany. The tuition and fees in German public universities are now zero. And that includes zero for non-German citizens, of whom there are, I believe, 300,000, whom they are educating at the expense of Germany, even though these people are Americans or British or Africans or anybody else. And I could go on. So what they're calling conservative is what in America would be called Bernie Sanders.
Right. So, and
but that wasn't enough for the Germans, so they went another step to the left. Last point. More important than the national election was a referendum in the city of Berlin. Here was the referendum that any landlord who had more than 1,000 apartments would have his apartments taken away, expropriated, taken away by the government, the public authority of the city of Berlin, in order to provide 250,000, because that's how many we're talking about, 250,000 apartments that would henceforth be public, affordable apartments. 85% of Berlin is rental. It's like Vienna. It's not like the United States. Rental is still the big thing. That referendum won. It won by a proportion of 56% to 39%. It wasn't even close. The people of Berlin voted to socialize apartments. I mean, in America, try to understand where the Europeans are going compared to the United States, and you will begin to understand the deep roots of a separation, a breaking down of an alliance in which the China is one story, but there are many other dimensions of it, which gives you a sense of how profound and how far along it already is.
And, I can't resist noting, since you mentioned the German health system, that it was initially created by Otto von Bismarck, a very conservative German politician. So the United States healthcare system, as of today, is more right-wing than the healthcare system instituted by a 19th century German chancellor, so conservative that he passed something called the anti-socialist laws. Right. So we are more conservative, the Democratic Party, for example, to the right of Otto von Bismarck. So the gulf, in some ways, I guess, is not a new thing, but it's remained extreme. What this gets me to, in a sense, is, I know people get uncomfortable with the use of empire as a word to describe the United States, but I think it's valid. And certainly economically and politically, we've imposed our will on large portions of the world for a very long time. And it seems to me, whether you call it empires, influence, dominance, that the United States era of growth and world power was, and you'll tell me if it's coincidental or not, largely coterminous with first FDR and the New Deal, kind of socialism light, if you will, then major public investment, during and after World War II and a federal highway system and so on. Again, not radical stuff, but much more than we have today. Now, China, with a planned economy and significant public sector investment, is rising. And I wonder if we aren't somehow, maybe the healthiest way to look at this shift in power would be, when the British Empire really did officially dismantle itself at the end of the Second World War, the Brits elected Socialist Party, a Labour Party that was a true Labour Party then, whatever its flaws, as opposed to what it is now. And they created the National Health Service. They had a national housing program. Instead of gnashing, and there were many British people who did, but instead of gnashing their teeth and wailing and tearing their hair out, they said, okay, we'll take care of our own people. I know I'm oversimplifying, but it seems to me that might not be a bad model for the United States to consider. Enough with 1,000 military bases around the world. Germany doesn't need our troops and so on. Why don't we create a country that's worth living in? Am I off base? I mean, am I missing something?
In my optimistic moments, which I have as often as I have the reverse, I say to myself, this is a kind of denial politics we're in now. This is a kind of shooting yourself in the foot mentality that often provokes its opposite. In other words, the dead end that I think we're in may impress itself enough on enough Americans in a position of power that they will draw the conclusion you just did, that that is they, those in power, those who run the big corporations, will be in a better condition coming to terms with China than continuing to be aggressive. Look, that's what Nixon and Kissinger did. They reached the conclusion, and believe me, that was discussed by the Business Roundtable and the Chamber of Commerce and everybody else. American business wanted in to the China situation, not kept out. They were watching Europeans and Japanese work their way in. They didn't want, and now they may come for different reasons, likewise to the conclusion that you just said. But let's remember also American history. The United States went to war against its colonial master, Britain, in 1774, 5, 6, as we all know and celebrate every 4th of July. And we defeated them and we became independent. They then had to decide, are you going to come to terms with the ex-colonial territory? And they debated it. And those who felt, no, let's recolonize them, had a war with us in 1812, not that much long afterwards. And they were defeated again, at which point they concluded, okay, we can't do it. So now let's come to terms with them. And they did. And for the rest of the 19th century and for the 20th century, as the British Empire declined, the roles were reversed. The master became the colony and the colony became the master. And that's certainly how it is today, and it's certainly how it's been for quite some decades now. I know that's not a happy picture, but let's remember that the British decided to do that as the lesser evil, that they could not maintain their empire. And that's why they, in the end, caved in India. That's why the passive resistance of Gandhi was able to succeed. I'm not taking anything away from the genius of what he did there and how he mobilized the Indian people. But in the end, the British tried militarily and every other way to hold on to what was their most valuable colony in the long run, but they couldn't. The expense of this resistance was beyond what they could do. And I think the United States is heading down exactly the same road. And my only fear is that as the United States economic dominance is already fatally compromised, they just don't have that anymore. And their politics is now quickly showing the same thing. China is discovering that if you're the second power in the world, and if you're scheduled to surpass in pure size the American economy by the end of this decade that we're already in, well, then your political power, whether you assert it or not, is going to be what it already is. That leaves one area, where the United States retains a certain kind of dominance, military. And I think you're watching the Chinese leadership, which understands this a lot better than I do, realize that's not the struggle we want with these folks, because there we're at a disadvantage. The only thing we have is 4 times the number of people. We can outlast them. But, that's crazy thinking, so we put that aside. So what are they doing? This may be the most ironic part of this, RJ. Their strategy, as I see it, is to outcompete the United States, continuing economically, but to do a new thing, to produce the kind of quality of society that will outcompete the United States in what some people call soft power. If you watch the last 2 months, they're taking money away from the rich and redistributing it to everybody else. They're bringing their poor out of poverty. They are clamping down on the big monopoly corporations. They are taking steps to provide the social services, the guarantees, the healthcare, the education, and everything else that's going to be the way they offer the world an alternative to the United States. And if I'm right, then the most remarkable thing is that the United States, instead of entering that competition, is making it easier for China because it's going in the other direction. It's taking things away from the mass of people. It is avoiding extending healthcare. It's avoiding doing the things it ought if it really wanted to compete. It's relying on an economic power it has lost, a political power it's in the process of losing, and a military power it couldn't dare really activate. This is a losing strategy.
It strikes me the last piece of this, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I get the sense that China is also lending money to developing countries and offering other forms of support on more generous terms
Absolutely.
Than the United States and the Western. And this, to me, I think that's huge and underreported because if you don't have to take an IMF loan that comes with usurious, demands cuts to social services and those sorts of things, but you can get a loan from China that's backed by, ideological moves like the ones you just described that has better terms for you and allows you to govern your country more closely to the way you'd like to govern it. It seems to me that, too, could see a shift of what used to be many years ago called the non-aligned countries. Remember that term?
Yeah.
Could see a real shift in alignment there, too, couldn't it?
On the ground, it's already there. And the roles of China and the United States in Africa have reversed. 30 years ago, the United States was pouring twice the amount of money into Africa as China did. Today, it's reversed. China has twice as much as the United States. The countries of Africa are turning, whatever the rhetoric is, the reality is. And the Chinese and that's why the West tries to use against China the old anti-colonial, anti-imperial, saying, they're not just here to help us. They have their own, they want that interest paid. They are trying to get, and there's truth to that, of course. The Chinese are not doing this out of some selfless nobility. They have their own strategy, which they put out there pretty straightforward. The Belt and Road Initiative is pretty well understood. But I think the bottom line is actually just as you put it. Those deals are being made because for the Africans, it's clearly the better way to go. They're dancing around it. They help the United States maintain its denial because they don't want to put their finger in the eye of the United States. That's a dangerous thing to do. The United States has reacted, by the way, over the last 10 years in establishing military installations all over Africa. everybody's very aware that the United States is spending money on military. The Chinese are loaning these countries money for railroads and harbors and all the rest of that. And again, this is a strategic decision of the United States. But in my judgment, given the way this world is now developing, I see American foreign policy as equivalent to the meetings of the board of directors of the Ford Motor Company when they decided to introduce the Edsel.
Well, the Edsel as an icon of an economic system or economic empire may be the closing thought here, but it's fascinating stuff. And I tell you, what's equally fascinating is our sort of color blindness to the shades, the new shades being introduced on the global stage. So that says a lot about our national personality, doesn't it? But
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. But as always, Richard Wolff, host of Economic Update and author of The Sickness is the System and other books, as always, thanks for coming on the program. It's always a great pleasure speaking with you.
Same here, RJ, and I look forward to our next time.
As do I. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.